Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second part of the lecture on Rene Magritte. And we find the artist. This is when he has returned to Brussels after he has left Paris, working with the other surrealists, and we find that he will continue to live in Brussels through World War II. What we will find is that we have a change in his subject matter. We have images like the present from 1939, where we again have the incorporation of those jingle bells, but you'll notice things that we haven't seen before in a lot of Magritte's works, if any at all. The Victory from 1939, I think, is an interesting painting where you'll notice that the doorway leads directly to a cliff, and not only that, it's kind of this transparent doorway at best, and maybe this is a remark on the artist's feeling of the situation. We then have the Return from 1940, where we have this beautiful blue sky, kind of this sensation of peace, but you'll notice that it's isolated. It's not the entire sky, and maybe with the terminology the return, that's something the artist is looking forward to. We also see during this period the return to a lot of the ideas that were successful in his previous artwork. Things like using the canvas on top of a window or another place, as in this painting, in order to indicate kind of this second surrealistic level. But the most interesting thing that we'll really find as we move towards the war period is that he actually has a dramatic change in style. And you'll notice this almost immediately with a painting like this one, The Fire, where you'll notice that his brushstrokes become a lot more like an impressionist, I would say, rather than that of a realistic painter. In this painting, The First Day from 1943, it is incredibly apparent, and this in fact looks more to me almost like a study to a Renoir painting rather than what we would think of as a Magritte painting. But it should be noted that he did go through this whole period of radical change in terms of his style. Return of the Flame from 1943 is really a painting, I think, that is about World War II, and you've got this masked figure, to me almost in this guise of death, kind of walking over the city with this red type of feeling throughout the entire thing. Lightning from 1944, we again have this impressionistic style, even to the point where it's almost becoming this kind of pointillist thing with him. And again, we're still doing the simple subtraction or addition that we know from his surrealism from before. In things like The Clearing, you'll notice that the plant leaves, excuse me, have been turned into birds, and to further the idea, we actually have a bird flying in the sky and a nest on the ground as well. One of the few paintings we have that directly deals with the idea of the war is Applied Dialects from 1945, where we have a diptych with each kind of relating to the other, and it's very strange because they're moving, the two groups are moving away from each other, with the military group moving to the left, and what we can assume are the refugees there moving to the right. Again, this kind of shows the consequences of one to the other, but what I think is interesting is the skies overhead, and in the military one, we can presume this is pre-war, while the one of the refugees, we can assume that this is post-war, just based on the sky and how it would appear, with the skies naturally getting darker due to combat situations. If you recall to his previous paintings, he had incorporated these banister chess pieces almost as these figurative forms, and by 1945 these figures have evolved into a much more figurative form, incorporated with eyes, and you'll even notice that one of them has a hand. I think a lot of his work during this period, I can't quite find the connection to the emblems as much as his previous work. I think during this period, in connection with the war, maybe he was searching for kind of a new direction in order to move his work. And what happens, as you'll kind of see from the images, is he goes through these kind of periods where he'll translate over and do work in this impressionist style, but then he'll actually revert back to the previous style that he did of much more of this illustrative type of image. This one I love. The Triumphant March is almost these cartoonish characters that he created. This almost looks like something you'd see on Saturday mornings as a cartoon rather than a painting by Magritte. And one of the more peculiar images I always think by him is from 1948 called The Stroke of Luck, again done in this kind of impressionist style with this strange pig creature kind of looking over its shoulder with a memorial there off in the background, maybe perhaps again a reflection of what occurred during the war. His work really does take an exploratory turn around 1948, leading forward, and you'll see all of these kind of images where, again, it's almost like he's trying to reinvent what he wants to say on a canvas. We also know that this is the beginning of the time that he began to forge other artists' work, including Picasso, and there was even a point where it was said that he would make fake money as well. Again, the post-war period, there's a lot of wonderful, crazy stories about artists. But again, moving through the work itself, you can see him kind of, I think that he's kind of searching for what to do, if you will. And in memory from 1948, again, it almost looks like he's trying to make a Salvador Dali painting with the placement of the pieces within the landscape itself. And then you have these radical kind of ventures off into almost free expression going onward from 1948. And again, most of these almost look like they're illustrative qualities rather than what you would think of as a gallery style painting that Magritte was making. But I think that they're very enjoyable, if nothing else, for just the oddity within his own creation. The ellipse from 1948, again, we have this strange hunter figure with his nose becoming the rifle and a third eye there on his bowler hat. And here with the mark from 1948 again, as close to a free expression as you'll really see from Magritte. And again, you kind of have to put this in juxtaposition with the very, very illustrative paintings that he did not even but 5 or 6 years ago. And here, Titania, this is this almost amalgamation of forms leading us into this purely organic kind of sense. And again, it's very almost difficult to imagine this being within the same catalog as someone who was painting something like Fashionable People from 1950. And it's also in 1950 with this painting that you kind of see this shifting back to what we saw before with his work, and even with the chess piece slash banister piece has become back to what it was before rather than this figurative form. And this kind of continues where we have paintings like Mental Complacency from 1950, where it's almost like he's using the boxes in the same way that he did with his work when he was in Paris working with the other surrealists, but now it's been transformed into a wall rather than that of a labeled kind of museum exhibition. From the Art of Conversation, painted in 1950, we again see these emblems of these, what I think of as chess pieces or banister pieces, now very, very large. And it's very interesting because we have this kind of culmination or group, but if you look down at their feet, in addition to them, there's actual people. So they've actually made them into these gigantic, almost, landmarks within the landscape themselves. In a darker painting, again, I think reflecting some of the ideas from the post-war period, we have the survivor with a lone rifle leaning up against the wall, and the shadow, or maybe just a stain of blood there on the ground itself. And again, you can kind of convey whatever you want to, but I always kind of am reminded of the year. And I always wonder if this is associated with that concept of survivor's guilt that many people had in the post war period. The other thing we see from this point forward is the inclusion of the famous man in the bowler hat, and this begins right around 1951 with paintings like Pandora's Box, where he's taken a pretty normal painting and really put this rose very close to the foreground and made the sky a very, very bright red. The interesting thing about this painting is there's nothing particularly surrealistic about it. You can encounter these colors at a sunset, and that flower being that close, you could actually do that just by happenstance. But the overall feeling of the painting is one that starts to lead us towards this dreamlike state. We actually see how well Magritte can paint in the painting Personal Values, done in 1952, where we have these selection of personal objects almost within a dollhouse where the walls have been painted that beautiful sky that he's very, very famous for painting. Another painting that we have where it's occupying what looks like a small room is the listening room with this gigantic apple kind of occupying the entire space. So either the room is too small or we're looking at a giant apple. This always makes me wonder about the Beatles, of course, from this time period too, and their inclusion of an apple in a lot of their musical imagery. Here we again see the man with the bowler hat, and this time he's become this aspect of rain just coming down on a landscape, and you'll notice that we've gone back to this idea of very simple paintings with just maybe one idea, like this one where you have just the outline of a boat and the water continuing into it, and a very interesting title, The Seducer, that kind of adds this extra layer or component to his work. In some ways, it's almost as if he started with this kind of concept or developed into this concept and then varied out. And then towards the end of his career, kind of moved his way back, but with this second set of knowledge of his experimentation and creating these new and interesting paintings at the kind of the later chapter of his life, many of which revolve around this figure, of course, in the bowler hat, which is again supposed to be this autobiographical image of the artist himself. What I find interesting is once he starts to really use this character, how he uses it as kind of this vehicle within the paintings itself in order to transmit some type of feeling of the viewer almost taking the place of that figure. What's interesting in this one, of course, is that he's reverting back to that impressionist style that we were talking about earlier, and as I mentioned, you can see it has affected some of his later work. In Clear Ideas from 1958, again, just very, very simple seascape with this floating boulder and again, this kind of reversion to the simplicity that he is so famous for within his paintings. Here we have a castle up on top of that same sort of stone hovering in the sky, and we have this kind of mythological quality that kind of emanates from the work itself. It's also important to remember that we're moving into the 1960s, and Magritte has often been thought of as a precursor to a lot of pop art with his use of very, very simplistic images, and many of those things being things that you would find in everyday life. And again, simple reversions, things like this, the just the idea of the simplicity of pop art, you can also kind of find within its work itself. Force of Habit from 1960 seems a very appropriate work for the 1960s because it really does kind of look like a sign with "This is not an apple" written in English, excuse me, and on the top, rather than "This is not a pipe" from his previous work. As we move into the tail end of Magritte's career, what we find is a lot of the same imagery that we found earlier from his paintings, but really, really kind of honed down to a very simplistic format, even from what we've seen before. In this, we have paintings like this, where we have him with his bowler hat, the presence of spirit from 1960, and we have, the image of a sculpted bird and also a fish. Again, a very, very simplified version of even what we would see from his previous paintings. Another good example of this can be found in The Tomb of the Wrestlers, an absolutely fabulous title, but what we have is a room, and again, a gigantic rose within the space, very similar to the apple that we had seen earlier, but now it's just been transformed. He also uses this leaf slash tree image quite frequently in his paintings as well. Here we see it once again with The Good Season from 1961. In Beautiful Works from 1962, we find the sky that he also uses as a symbol quite often in his work, coming back into focus within the painting. He'll continue this in a few of his paintings that he does from 1962. Here we have the bowler, or the image of the bowler from High Society from 1962, with that image of the clouds and a secondary image of that same figure behind him with some greenery, again, kind of showing two different versions of a landscape. Here we have the back of the bowler from the Spirit of Adventure, looking out over the plains. And as I mentioned before, a lot of what we see in these kind of later work are very simplified versions. If you look very closely, you can see two smaller figures within that one as well. He's finally given retrospectives in both 1965 and in 1992 in the United States. It's very interesting because he had a very long life, and the work that we've actually looked at here is just a small fraction of what he actually painted. But the truth remains that he really didn't have success until much later in his life, and this is very much an example of somebody who never quite gave up and was eventually rewarded for his efforts. I think that Magritte leaves an important legacy on both surrealism and also art, because he's one of the first artists to really just look at singular objects and the power that they contain. And oftentimes with paintings like this one, where he's just doing a simple reversal, where again you can see the window has this wonderful sky, but as it's opening, you see this sense of blackness. That little simplicity is very, very viewer friendly, and for a lot of people is an easy access point into surrealism. His famous figure with the bowler hat, which really didn't come along until probably the second half of his career, and what he's most famous for, again, is meant to be autobiographical, but I think for many people it's another access point into this concept of surrealism, where you can just take simple ideas like this one, where we have man in a bowler hat, and just this idea of a bird flying across his face as if a photo was taken at the wrong moment, shows how these wonderful surrealistic moments can occur just in everyday life as well. And so for Magritte, I think that his power and his legacy will always be found in his simplicity.